What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so getting into the Iron Metropolitan, what I want to do before we start this is I want to run over the 10 rings of the Mandarin. And the reason why is because of the fact that what Kieran Gillen is going to do is basically turn the rings of the Mandarin into the equivalent of lantern rings in Marvel Comics. Now, the reason why I say this is because of the fact that the rings themselves are actually going to start seeking out people in this particular story and going into the rings of the Mandarin. And the lantern rings in DC Comics serve the same purpose. You have the ability to instill great hope. That's the Blue Lantern rings. You have the ability to instill great fear. That's the Sinestro Corps rings. Because of that, it's really one of these scenarios where Marvel's just kind of borrowing from DC, but it's done in a way that still works. Now, with regards to the rings of the Mandarin, there are 10 of them, and each of the rings has its own distinct property or ability that makes it separate from any of the other rings. Now, in truth, I compared all the information from the Marvel Wiki to the comics, so the Marvel Wiki is actually right this time. And so we're just going to kind of go with the list that they have there. But the Remaker is basically a ring that allows the Mandarin to manipulate the atomic and molecular structure of matter, but it cannot transmute elements or affect objects encased in force or energy fields, meaning it cannot turn something into gold. And if something's behind a force field, it can't do anything to access it. The Influence ring allows the Mandarin to generate and project various beams of concussive force. Pretty straightforward. The Spin ring causes the air to move about at high speeds like it were in a vortex, and the vortex can be used as an offensive weapon, as a means of levitating objects, or as a means of propelling the ring's wearer through the air, basically giving them the power of flight. The Spectral ring allows the Mandarin to project a beam of energy capable of destroying the bonds between the atoms and molecules of any particular object, causing inanimate objects to disintegrate. The problem with this is the ring has to recharge for 20 minutes after each use. Of course, this is basically a caveat that allows Marvel to keep the Mandarin from being a guy who can just manipulate matter on the atomic scale anytime he wants to. Now, the Nightbringer ring allows the Mandarin to create an area of darkness, presumably using Dark Force energy to do so. Now, Dark Force energy is almost like Fanta Black in a lot of different ways. For those of you guys who don't know what that is, Fanta Black is a shade of black that's so incredibly dark that anything that's sprayed with the color Fanta Black basically just looks like a hole in reality. It's crazy how dark it is. Like, there's one image circulating out there somewhere of a basketball that was sprayed with Fanta Black, and it looks like it's just a hole in reality. It's crazy how it looks. Like, it's really kind of mind-blowing. But for those of you guys who are reading Secret Empire, Dark Force energy is what was used to basically encase all of New York so that Doctor Strange and everybody was just kind of trapped in another dimension. So again, it's really one of these things where it just harnesses other dimensional power. But the Daemonic ring allows the Mandarin to generate and manipulate various forms of electromagnetic energy. The Incandescence ring allows the Mandarin to project blasts of infrared and produce flame or ignite combustible material. The Lyre, which is actually going to be one of the more interesting rings in this story, magnifies the Mandarin's psionic energies, allowing him to mentally manipulate the thoughts and actions of others, and we'll actually hint on how that was used by the Mandarin himself here in a little bit. The Lightning ring allows the Mandarin to project blasts of electrical energy. It literally does exactly what it sounds like. It generates lightning. The Zero ring allows the Mandarin to project waves of intense cold and ice, including trapping foes in ice blocks and sheaths. So it basically just kind of allows the Mandarin to manipulate cold weather. That's really it. It kind of like gives them the power of Iceman in a lot of different ways. Now, having run over that list real quick, the whole basis behind the idea of really Iron Metropolitan is to show us what the potential could possibly be with the Arno and Stark brothers. Remember, of course, in the last video, we talked about how Tony Stark had learned about his brother Arno, basically the genetically engineered brother that's the biological child of Howard and Maria Stark, and that Tony himself was basically just adopted. And so again, this was really kind of cool because it served two purposes. The first was creating a more compelling story, and the second was actually bringing to us the idea that Tony Stark is as smart as he is because he's just that smart. It's just genuine natural intelligence. So again, it's kind of a cool scenario. But with regards to the future that really beholds the Earth for these two guys, remember, Tony Stark was basically told by Recorder 451 prior to its death, more or less, that the Earth was a potential beacon for peace across the universe. And we know just by virtue of Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, that time will eventually come, something like 10,000 years in the future, or 5,000 years. I don't remember what it is, but there's actually a place called Avengers World. But with regards to getting to that place, what we end up having is really like this glimpse 30 years into the future here where Tony Stark and Arno have basically generated peace across the planet Earth. They have this massive city called Troy, and this city basically creates pure energy for the world to use. It really creates a kind of utopia. The downside to this is that they currently have an AI called Helen, and Helen is modeled largely after Recorder 451, but as Tony Stark puts it, was designed to basically stay away from all the glitches and the mistakes that will come along with artificial intelligence. Of course, this turns out not to be the case. Helen goes awry and begins the process of tearing up everything that Tony Stark and Arno Stark have built. Now, of course, in response to this, they end up sending out, some 20,000 Iron Man suits that are piloted by AIs modeled after Pepper Potts, after James Rhodes, but in the end, it doesn't make any difference. Everything they've worked for has been destroyed. And so what we end up learning is that this is actually a simulation that both Arno Stark and Tony Stark are experiencing, and in every single instance of this simulation, the AI Helen that they create ultimately goes awry. Now, the reason why this is important is because Stark, or I guess Tony and Arno, take two different stances on this. Arno's response is, you cannot toy with AI. Every single simulation we've run, the AI will always become sentient and it'll always run amok. In Tony Stark's mind, there's going to be a way around it. There's got to be a way to basically set up that AI so it will not go down that path. It will not become a villain, more or less. And so again, it's really kind of wild because we learned that Tony Stark had basically brought, Recorder 451 back to Earth for the purpose of really doing nothing more than just kind of experimenting on and learning about the technology that it has. Because remember, with that recorder having been around for millions of years, it assimilated all different kinds of technology from across the universe, technology that humanity hasn't even experienced yet. The only way to access it is in Recorder 451. So again, Tony Stark basically has preview to technology and advances that humanity would otherwise never have access to. But at the end of the day, his mind is still that they can create this utopia for the world, and they can literally transform Earth into a beacon of peace across the universe. But the first step is finding a way to salvage and to access all the technology within, Recorder 451 and basically save Earth itself. And so from here, this is when we begin the process of switching over to the idea of essentially Marvel's version of the Green Lantern rings, in the sense that one of the Mandarin rings arrives to a woman by the name of Abigail Beryl Burns, who really goes by the name Red Peril, essentially, as she puts it. She's really more of like a journalist, but she goes through and writes about corporations that engage in seedy actions and different things like that. But she's really just kind of pissed off at the world, and like she hates capitalism and different things like that. And so the result is that she's given a ring and she's deemed to be Mandarin 7. And the idea is to essentially take revenge against Tony Stark. Now, we don't really know why. We don't know why these rings are taking revenge against Tony Stark. And in fact, the rings have never become sentient before. The rings are only ever objects that were used by the Mandarin to basically fight against Tony Stark. So this is wholly new. This is brand new stuff by Kieran Gillen. And it's actually really kind of cool to see it all unfold. But what we also end up finding out here is the first stage to Tony Stark's plan of basically revamping the world is traveling to Mandarin City. Now, this is kind of interesting because when Matt Fraction first introduced Mandarin City, there wasn't really a whole lot to go on there. It was just there. one day. The Mandarin just kind of had a base of operations in Mandarin City. The only indication we were given was that it was someplace off the coast of China, that the Mandarin presumably used some kind of seedy, means, used, his liar ring, for example, the ability to manipulate the minds of others to basically give himself that island or to take it from China. And that was really it. But during the whole Long Way Down storyline, when the Mandarin basically kidnapped both Ezekiel Stane, the son of Obadiah Stane, and Tony Stark, and forced them to begin building these giant, mechanized suits that would allow the Mandarin essentially to engage in world domination, they effectively turned against him. But where Tony Stark was working to defeat the Mandarin using technology and taking down these various powered suits and so on and so forth, Ezekiel Stane actually fought the Mandarin and killed him. And so what it did is it basically left Mandarin City with a giant power vacuum. And so what started happening is that all these different warlords and these petty criminals who were living under the Mandarin began to vie for power. And so you had triads, who were showing up, these Asian-based gangs and so on and so forth. And really, Mandarin City just kind of turned into a giant war zone. Now, Tony Stark going in here alongside Arno Stark, who's basically piloting some of the Stark armors, is designed for the purpose of basically clearing the city out, seizing control of a Mandarin City, and then basically turning it into like this refuge, turning it into this safe haven. And so what we end up doing is we travel to basically the core, which is, within Mandarin City more or less. And what we have Tony Stark doing is taking the Pepper AI, removing her from him, putting her inside the core of the system, and renaming her Helen. And so because of this, it's it's really kind of Tony Stark falling down the path of becoming the guy that's eventually going to lead to this Helen robot losing its mind and destroying everything. So again, it's almost one of these scenarios where it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. From here, we kind of skip forward, a little bit, or at least we kind of pick up in the modern day where Stark had previously, kind of cleared out Mandarin City. But the fact remains, with all the construction and everything that's taking place here, once Mandarin City is basically cleaned out and once it's renamed to Troy, we end up, of course, having Tony Stark making a declaration to all those who are present, making a declaration to the press that Troy is going to serve as a beacon. It's going to serve as a place where those people who are living in destitution, those people who are living in squalor, they can leave their struggling areas and they can come to a place that's new. Now, this is really kind of cool because it's really one of those scenarios where Marvel, or really Kieran Gillen's, building on what's already been established. And that's really kind of the way it goes. In Marvel Comics, there was really a place called Asteroid M, or Avalon, depending on what you choose to call it, that was created by Magneto. And it was designed to be a safe haven for mutants away from the oppressive regime of humanity. Now, of course, this basically put humanity in a state of fear. When you end up having, almost all forces basically withdrawing from an area, that means something really bad is going to happen. And so because of that, humanity, looking at it from a wartime perspective, believed that, Magneto was pulling all the mutants off of Earth because he was in turn going to cleanse the Earth in its entirety, just eradicate everybody on Earth. So of course, humanity struck against Magneto. Magneto struck back, issued a blanket EMP around the planet. The X-Men intervened, and that led into fatal attractions when Wolverine lost his adamantium. So again, it was really kind of a cool scenario in terms of how it all kind of unfolded and what led to what and different things like that. But this is still very much the same thing. Tony Stark going into an existing territory that's basically in a state of flux, co-opting it, and then making it his own. The issue with this is that while all this goes down, we end up finding out another ring had basically bonded to somebody else, this person going by the name of Mandarin 1. Now, of course, we don't know who this person is, but Tony Stark immediately recognizes the signatures of the ring. Now, of course, Abigail takes this opportunity to effectively attack Tony Stark. So it's really more of an alliance without an intention to be an alliance. And so she's just kind of jumping into the moment and using the distraction as a way to basically take on Stark. Now, of course, donning his Iron Man suit, we end up finding out how far Stark has come, because remember, all of this comes out of Extremis. And so while Tony Stark had long since abandoned the Extremis technology, the fact remains here that what he ends up doing is basically creating a stealth suit for himself that he's been wearing the entire time. It's just you didn't know it was there because it's a stealth suit. So it's actually kind of cool. But from here, things are pretty straightforward. I mean, in the sense that he's able to run off, Abigail for a time and basically kind of retreats. And that's really about it. And so the question that Tony Stark has is, if that was a ring of the Mandarin, then what happened to the rings of the Mandarin? Now, the reason why we ask that question is because of the fact that the rings are extremely dangerous, and they're not like lantern rings, right? Like if you were someone who just walked up and picked up a Green Lantern ring, if it doesn't deem you as being a person that's worthy to wield it, you wouldn't be able to use it. The rings of the Mandarin don't work that way. Anybody can put it on, and suddenly they've got all the powers that come along with it. And so what Tony Stark does is, alongside James Rhodes, investigate the SHIELD Weapons Vault Omega. Now, this is a multifaceted vault, and the reason why is because of the fact that if you've ever wondered what happens to the weapons of massive villains who launch an attack and they're defeated and so on and so forth, they're all basically stationed in different vaults, and there's a lot of places like that around the Marvel Universe. But because the rings of the Mandarin do not require any measure of worth in order to be able to use them, or at least previously they didn't, once Tony Stark and James Rhodes begin to go there and they basically start looking around, they see all the rings that are there. But having an AI scan it means that the AI will see what's truly there and will not see what their eyes see. And this is when we learn that the liar ring had basically been duping everybody, that once a week, a member of SHIELD will go down there, they will investigate, they'll check and make sure all the rings are there. And if they are, they'll seal everything back up and they'll leave. The liar ring had basically been making it appear as though all the rings were there to the human eye, messing with people's psychological mindsets. But an AI does not have a psychological mind. It's literally just tech. And so because of that, Tony Stark and James Rhodes are basically informed all the other rings of the Mandarin are just out there. Of course, the liar ring being the last one to take off and do its own thing. Now, again, this is kind of wild because the rings are essentially becoming sentient. That's never happened before. Again, we're in uncharted territory here. And so what we end up finding out here is that where Abigail, or Red Peril, of course, has been chosen to wield one of the rings of the Mandarin, her allegiance is not so cut and dry. And that's what makes things kind of cool, is because usually in Marvel Comics, when a villain or when a person is given absolute power and they have an agenda, they usually become a bad guy. Abigail is not that way. She got a ring of the Mandarin and she has this ring's abilities, but she's a journalist first, and whatever she is now, second, a villain or an anti-hero, whatever you want to call her. And so her idea is to investigate the city. What's really going on? Does Tony Stark have an ulterior motive, or is he actually doing the right thing? And what we end up finding out is that the way this city city is designed to function, it's designed to basically create perpetual energy. It's designed to be a city where people won't have to pay utility bills, where it'll basically feed people by generating food. They won't have to go and buy groceries. It'll be 100% self-contained, renewable system. And that's something no one's ever seen before. This is a tried and true utopia. And once Abigail begins to realize this is when she comes to the conclusion that the city is quite literally designed to make everything better for anybody who's in it. So Tony Stark is actually benefiting humanity instead of profiteering off humanity. And so what this does is it really changes the perspective that Abigail has of Tony Stark. She still looks at him as just kind of like a weapons manufacturer and a profiteer, but in this instance, he's trying to do the right thing. And so tearing the city down would actually hurt people as opposed to help them. And so what we end up having is basically her being led to the other individuals out there who have the rings of the Mandarin. For example, a guy who has the Remaker ring calls himself Lord Remaker. And so again, because of this, this leads to really just kind of like a massive conflict between, these other members of the Mandarin Corps, and I guess we could really kind of call it the Mandarin Corps, but these other members of the Mandarin Corps, Iron Man, with Abigail fighting alongside Iron Man. And this is really kind of cool because again, she's very much an anti-hero here in the sense that she's really kind of working against Tony Stark as much as she's working for him, in the sense that she's on his side, but only for the short term. But in this massive conflict, the building that houses Arno Stark effectively comes crashing down. So this is kind of crazy because the implication here was that this would be the death of Arno Stark. And it would be kind of a pretty lackluster scenario if that were the case, just because of the fact that Arno has proven himself to be one of the most intelligent members of the Stark family. I mean, really, he's in a lot of ways, I would surmise, smarter than Tony Stark. And so because of this, nothing that Stark has done here with regards to Mandarin City, the city of Troy, none of this would be possible without Arno. Stark couldn't pull it off. Of course, we end up finding out that Arno actually survived the blast. And what he'd been doing is he had been working on his own version of an Iron Man suit. But it's not really a traditional Iron Man suit as we think of it. Instead, it's basically just a massive tank. Now, of course, this is kind of funny because it's half wish fulfillment and half practicality. One thing you got to think of is that Arno Stark spent his entire life confined to a bed in an iron lung. And so all the intelligence and everything he had more or less went to waste because he could never use any of it. But it didn't keep him from imagining what kind of life he could have. In this scenario, with the work that they've done, with the work that Arno Stark and the work that Tony Stark have done together, being attacked by this Mandarin Corps, we essentially have Arno building his own Iron Man suit, this massive battle tank, and just kind of like riding high into the conflict. And it's actually really cool to see because again, it's practical. It's not designed to be this super maneuverable suit because there's already a ton of those. It's designed to be a suit that can basically control the different models that are out there. The reason being because of course, the Helen AI has more or less been taken down at this point. And so because of that, the Iron Man suits are just kind of flying around on autopilot. Some of them are being shot down, some of them are shooting at the wrong targets, but having a suit ran by Arno that can consolidate the AI of all these other suits into a singular source means that he can control all the other suits. And so what we end up having here is one of the members of the Mandarin Corps basically just kind of vanishes out of nowhere. And no one really knows where he went to. Of course, Abigail begins to poke around and finds out that the guy has been decapitated. Not only that, her hands are basically cut off by some unknown source and her ring is taken from her. And so again, what it seems like is someone around there, somebody somewhere, is consolidating all these Mandarin rings unto themselves, which begs the question, are they the ones that activated the Mandarin rings in the first place and made them sentient? Initially, we're not given this explanation. Instead, all we end up having is Abigail without hands. Of course, her hands are basically cut off, but she continues to kind of scream at Tony Stark about her, agenda and so on and so forth. And that's really about it. But at the end of the day, because of the fact that Troy has just kind of collapsed the way that it does, because of the fact that Abigail made the case that, look, you're building a city here, that's great for everyone that lives here, but the target's always you. Everybody's always coming after you. So long as you're here, you're making Troy a target. Because of that, Tony Stark basically kind of gets up on a podium and says, look, I tried running a city, it was really too much of a hassle, so I quit. And then just leaves. And that's really it. Instead, he leaves the running of the city to his brother Arno Stark. And so with that in mind, what we end up finding out here is that where the hands of Abigail were cut off, one of the members of the Mandarin Corps was decapitated, the person who had done this was actually Malekith the Accursed. Of course, as we know, one of the Dark Elves from Svartalheim. And so what this does is it basically brings the Asgardians into the mix. And it really kind of asks the question, what would happen if a being who's already godlike in terms of their durability and strength were to gain virtually godlike powers because of the rings of the Mandarin? So it's actually really kind of cool to see how this would unfold. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like. And yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.